Public Library as part of our efforts to support our democratic resilience. So before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on. So TMU is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. And so we at the dais and also at the university are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice for Indigenous peoples generally. And I would say this has been a big focus for TMU through its reconciliation efforts over the past few years. And so before I hand things off, I would just say today's conversation obviously comes at a time where Canadians are thinking a lot about sovereignty, about democracy. One point that Andrew makes in the book is we like to pat ourselves on the back for our democracy. And I think these days in particular, when we look at what's happening south of the border, we're maybe a little bit complacent about the actual state of our democracy. So I think part of what we'll focus on today is maybe disabusing ourselves of some of that complacency. And I would just say we're very excited to have Andrew here. I'm a longtime reader and listener. The fiscal conservatism speaks to my heart as a former Ontario finance official. A key voice on national political issues. The at-issue panel last week, where on the Canada-Alberta agreement, where it got a little spicy with Althea, was excellent listening. So very excited. And also to have Sanjay here with us, who is a leading thinker on democracy here at the university and a key ally of ours as well. And so with that, I will hand it over to the most excellent host of the TMU Democracy Forum, to Martin Regg. So he's the founder of the Democracy Forum, political columnist at the Toronto Star, was also a foreign correspondent and covered national politics in Ottawa. Perhaps, I'm sure, crossing paths with Andrew on all these things. He's a senior fellow with us at the dais, but also at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at U of T. And so with that, over to you.
Thanks, Andre. Thank you. Bienvenue, bonjour. Welcome to our 43rd Democracy Forum at Toronto Met, where we try to do democracy differently and more democratically. And today, we'll try to do democracy more in depth, down in the weeds. What do I mean by that? I think a lot of us think of democracy as a question of high principle, but it's also at root, in practice, it's all about process, right? It's about execution, not just concepts. And a lot of us Canadians like to look around the world and think about or worry about whether an election overseas is free and fair. And then when we think about what's happening at home, we say, well, of course, it's free at home. No one's blocking you at gunpoint at the polls. But is it fair? That's the question a lot of people are scratching their heads about. And when I was overseas as a foreign correspondent for about 11 years, I spent a lot of my time looking at and covering people who were ready to die for democracy, were really ready to take a bullet just to cast for the right to cast a ballot. And then you come home and you find that Canadians are often quite indifferent to democracy and what's at stake. Luckily, we have our guest today who has written a book about what he calls the crisis. And I think his thesis, if I may put words in his mouth or on paper, is that Parliament is powerless, the Prime Minister is all powerful, and the people are disempowered. So let me tell you a little bit about our gloomy guest. Andrew Coyne is a columnist for the Globe and Mail, and as Andre mentioned, is often on the CBC at News panel. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto and the London School of Economics. He was previously an editor and a columnist at the National Post and Maclean's. He's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Walrus. And he doesn't put this in his bio, but I happen to know he was also on the editorial board of the Globe and Mail, writing lots of pristine editorials, which he didn't necessarily agree with because he was maintaining caucus solidarity. But we'll revisit that challenge and that contradiction and tension later on. So he's the author of this book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. There you are. As Johnny Carson would always do on television, I want to make sure that the book gets some available at bookstores everywhere, and Andrew will sign your copies, I am sure. That's published by Sutherland House Books. Welcome to Toronto Met, Andrew. Now,
thank you.
as you can guess, it wouldn't be a fair fight because Andrew is a skilled journalist, and so he knows all the tradecraft. So to help me level the playing field, I've got a colleague from TMU, very distinguished colleague, Sanjay Ruparelia, sitting beside me, is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration and also holds the Jarislowsky Chair at TMU, the Jarislowsky Democracy Chair, not just any chair at TMU. He has a PhD and master's from the University of Cambridge and a BA from McGill. He was associate professor of politics at the New School for Social Research in New York, and also assistant director of the South Asia Institute, a lecturer at Columbia University, and a consultant to the United Nations. Welcome, Sanjay. Welcome back to the Democracy Forum. You've been here before. So
true. I started this. You had to bring in a ringer, didn't you, Martin?
Well, there you are.
I had to bring in the Regis professor of.
We're a tag team, so we've worked before. Watch out. No, I'm kidding. Okay, first, some housekeeping. A reminder to everyone in the audience: when you registered, and again when you checked in, you agreed to abide by our code of conduct. Of course. We welcome your questions, just as long as you let our guest answer the questions. We use the Slido app. Catherine and Andre and Tanya, do we have the codes available? Is Slido working? I think we can. Yeah, we're going to switch the slide so you can see how to register. It's very digital. We love it. It's very democratic. If that fails us, we can just talk to each other and you can raise your hand. We'll figure it out. So I will kick off the questions and Sanjay and I will share some of that for a little while and then we'll turn it over to you. So start thinking up your questions. Don't worry, Andrew has all the answers. So first question, I've known Andrew a while, so I'm just kidding around a little bit. First question though, a serious question is, which every interviewer asks every author, why did you finally write this book now? Why now? Why is the time so important?
I could make up some claim, and I will, but mostly it was a matter of I went to lunch with Ken White, my longtime editor and publisher and friend and former employer, and he kind of popped the idea in my head as saying, well, you know, why don't you do something that pulls together all these different ways in which our system is malfunctioning? You know, you've been writing about each of them at various points in column form, but maybe there's something you've not done in sort of the big picture, pulling it all together. And as I thought about that, it seemed like something that was doable. And certainly I would say one of the things that we run up against on this issue is every government comes in, every prime minister comes in promising to change the system, to make it more accessible, to make it more democratic, et cetera, and they all wind up tightening the screws even tighter. And the most spectacular example of that is probably Justin Trudeau, who not only on the famous issue of this will be the last election held under first past the post in bold black letters in their platform, but on a range of things where Stephen Harper was rightly perceived to have taken things even further than previous prime ministers in abusing the powers of the prime minister and basically running roughshod over Parliament. There were a number of things where the Trudeau government said, we'll never do that again, and they did exactly that again. So I do think we've kind of reached a terminus of cynicism as a result of that. And the final point that I'll retroactively tack onto it in terms of the timing is we did go through this period in the first 5-6 months of this year where we're in the middle of an existential crisis. The President of the United States is threatening to annex us. The country's in turmoil and in a panic. And for the first 5-6 months of the year, the Parliament sat dark. And did anybody even notice? And when you said, gosh, I think it'd be a good idea for Parliament to sit in the middle of this national crisis so that we can hash out our, you know, what should we do and voice our fears and try to come up with a common front, people would look at you like you had two heads and say, well, why would Parliament want to meet? Which kind of, you know, as I say, retroactively justifies the timing.
So were you complacent yourself though, or were you a fellow Canadian who was like the frog in a pot of boiling water and you couldn't detect the temperature rising? Because a crisis suggests that we were paralyzed. And I wonder, let me throw this at you. Is it a crisis in democracy or is it a crisis in society? Does that democratic crisis reflect a disintegration or a degradation of society, where we're disengaged, where we are, of course, I will have to say this, you can see where I'm going, we are amped up by social media, which is then amplified, the anger algorithms are then amplified by the mass media, and we become more and more polarized, paranoid, and angry. Isn't that part of it?
It is. I don't get into that a great deal. There's some talk about social media. You can write a whole book on that. This book is quite small c conservative, if you will, in that what I'm really just looking at is the system that we think we have, the parliamentary democracy that we think we've had for 150 years. And looking at it and saying, well, actually, if you look at the way it actually functions or doesn't, the points at which it's failing are so manifest and so many that it's debatable whether we really have a functioning democracy. We go through all the forms and the rituals and we tick out all the boxes, but in terms of whether the members of parliament we elect actually represent us, whether the parliament that we elect collectively has any real capacity to hold the government to account, these are really debatable propositions. Certainly when you look at our electoral system where the parliaments that we elect look nothing like what we voted for, there's a lot of questions you could certainly ask about that. I wouldn't have said I was complacent about it. I think I've been raising the alarm for some time, but I would say even I, who thought I knew how bad things were, in the course of researching the book, certainly came across a lot of things that I hadn't known, that other people had been working on, that really did seem to accentuate the concerns that I had.
Yeah.
Last point, sorry, what I meant to make, sorry, is if you ask, what's the crisis, you could almost say, is the crisis may be that nobody realizes we're in a crisis. The crisis is that we've grown so used to the parliament being so weak and meaningless that we find it hard to conceive of what a meaningful parliament would look like. And so therefore we're not too terribly put out when that parliament yet again fails to deliver. But it is striking, Jeffrey Simpson wrote that wonderful book, The Friendly Dictatorship, in 2000, I think it was, about the Chrétien government. And certainly at the time we thought we'd never seen such centralization of power under any prime minister previously. Now we look back on sort of the last hurrah of cabinet government, maybe not parliamentary government, but it was a relatively strong cabinet in those days. So it really does, just when we think we've wrapped our minds around how bad things have got, it exceeds our expectations, and we're periodically upset by that, but then we settle back into going, oh, well, why would we expect anything different?
And yet, arguably, it might have started the culmination perhaps was in Justin Trudeau, but it began, I think, in your book with Pierre Trudeau, like father, like son. But Sanjay.
So first, thanks to Dea St. Martin for inviting me to join this conversation. I love reading this book. It's really well written. It's very incisive. I left Canada for 25 years, just to give a little background. When I came back in 2019, having studied India for a long time and lived in Britain and the US, I left just before the referendum, tells you how long ago it was. And when I came back, I was struck exactly what Andrew says in the book. But, I'd meet lots of Canadians say, well, we're in a great democracy. A lot of the international surveys say we do so well. And of course, you rank really high. And yet a lot of the things that he talks about in the book, I felt impressionistically, but I thought maybe it's just I've been away too long and I'm a bit of a curmudgeon. So maybe I'm trying to find things that aren't really wrong. And the book really lays out in forensic kind of detail, a pretty devastating critique. So let me, you already answered the question I was going to ask. I'm going to ask it in a different way. So say, well, are we in a crisis? Because it's a great title for a book, right? We're in a crisis. So I'll put on my sort of political science wonk hat for a moment. And when I think of a crisis, just think of a medical crisis. You'd normally think a crisis is when things can't go on anymore unless something fundamentally changes. Something you have to intervene. And that to me then becomes one of the puzzles. I mean, there are lots we're going to talk about, but the severe concentration of executive power in Canada is decades old. As Andrew says in the book, at least back to the 70s. And yet, here we are, right? Election after election. There's a lot of, we've had national unity crisis. We might have another one, but relative political stability compared to other places. So that's what I was trying to get at is, you've already answered it in one way. A crisis is that we don't know we're having a crisis, but it's still a puzzle that things just keep ticking along. Yeah. And that raises all kinds of other questions. But let me ask you again, say so what exactly is the crisis? Is it that we have a we have a form of democracy that's a shell without the substance, as you say, or is it something else?
We have a number of, I would call, apprehended crises that or potential crises, let's put it that way, that I think are waiting to blow up at any given time. Let me give you a few examples. One is we've been able to we sort of finessed the Senate all these years. Initially, it was the Fathers' Confederation thought they'd make a very weak upper house by making it appointed. Surely senators would never vote down legislation by the democratically elected House of Commons. Well, they started doing that immediately, did it quite routinely, quite frequently in the 1800s. Settled down in the mid-20th century. Basically, the convention was, you would almost never interfere with legislation by the Commons. Recent decades, they've been starting to get feistier, and particularly since the Trudeau reforms, where they were not supposedly any more patronage appointments, they were appointed on the basis of their independent, nonpartisan merits, which allowed a lot of them to say, well, I'm not a partisan hack. I have a mandate of virtue. And for the first few years of the Trudeau government, Justin Trudeau government, when there were still a lot of conservatives in the Senate, it was perpetually bubbling under that at some point they were going to defeat legislation in the House of Commons. It died away as Trudeau appointed more and more nonpartisan appointees, may not have been card-carrying capital liberals, but reliably small L liberals. And as this term wore on, they became more capital L liberals. And we're now faced with a situation where they're 90% appointed by liberal prime ministers, where Pierre Poilievre, who everyone thought was going to win this last election and has a decent chance of winning the next one if he holds on to his leadership, has vowed to invoke the notwithstanding clause and on behalf of various legislation. Would be the first time a federal prime minister had done so. You have liberal senators, capital L or small L liberal, saying we're going to defeat that legislation if he brings it forward. Point being, we're heading for something in the Senate, potentially, certainly, which will be a full-blown constitutional crisis. Point one. Point two, we have not figured out any kind of coherent theory that everyone buys into of when does power change hands between elections, if at all. So we've had two recent examples of this where, first of all, that when Stephen Harper prorogued Parliament rather than face a confidence vote that he was pretty sure to lose, and a lot of, the other parties said, well, we can form a coalition government. It didn't wind up happening, but you had a lot of large C conservatives advancing a theory that said it's not legitimate. It's only legitimate to change powers with elections, which is actually not our constitutional conventions, but they're kind of trying to make up a new one. So that's can potentially blow up at some point. And there's a closely allied one, which is supposing the liberals, and again, this at one point, this was looked like it might be a potential in this last election, supposing the liberals win fewer seats than the conservatives, but enough that they can put together a majority government with the help of the NDP and stay in power, as Mackenzie King did in 1925. Absolutely legal, absolutely in line with our constitutional conventions, but you get large C conservatives, including respectable theorists, saying, no, that's not right. It has to go to the party that wins the most seats. Not true, but if enough people believe it, we've got the seeds of a crisis there. Third crisis that we're potentially facing is we are now, because of Donald Trump, by wide agreement, plunged into a very different peril-strewn era, when a lot of the things we thought we could assume about Canada and its place in the world, including our national security, are up for grabs. And so there's a large agreement that we've got to diversify our trade, we've got to build up our military, we've got to stand on our own 2 feet, have more international alliances that aren't dependent on the Americans, all kinds of things, all of which, each one of which is a huge undertaking in itself, involves massive policy changes. Massive policy changes inevitably have winners and losers. And in this country, often as not, those will be distributed regionally. And we don't have a good track record, arguably, you can look at it half full or half empty, in terms of mediating those regional differences. And a lot of that has to do with our political system, our electoral system, which exaggerates and exacerbates our pre-existing differences because it presents this wildly distorted picture where there's supposedly no liberals west of Ontario and no conservatives in Quebec, and no liberals in rural Canada and no conservatives in metropolitan Canada, and the NDP are wildly distorted in their representation. All these things have regional components. We certainly saw this during the National Energy Program when the Liberals had 2 seats west of Ontario and 74 of 75 seats in Quebec. and just rammed through this incredibly divisive policy. Well, is that what we're going to do going forward? Are we going to repeat that mistake with these big policy choices we've got to make? Are we going to get a government that's elected with 37% of the vote in one part of the country, with a parliament that nobody thinks is able to hold that government to account or rein it in? Is it going to ram through some sweeping agenda that might be good policy or might not, but which large sections of the country are going to go, wait a minute, I wasn't consulted on this. I didn't agree with this. I'm going to be really materially affected by this. I think there's real potential either that we blow up into another unity crisis. And by the way, not just one crisis, but potentially two in Alberta and Quebec, and with the President of the United States perhaps egging both of them on. So do we either plunge into that, or to avoid doing that, do we just kind of do our usual thing and push it on and kick the can down the road and don't deal with these pressing issues for fear of that? All of these things to me say at some point, either because we're in a crisis or because we're paralyzed, maybe it will occur to us to say, we got to change the way we make decisions, that's the fundamental cause of a lot of our difficulties.
Andrew, you've given us, you've come back to Sanjay with not one, but three crises. But you asked almost a rhetorical question: Do we kick the can down the road? Spoiler alert: if you haven't read the book, Andrew confesses after eviscerating the Senate and the virtuous Senate that really there is no way to change it until there is a crisis. I think, is that a fair way to say that it's just going to keep on happening? We're walking towards a crisis.
I actually have a fix for the Senate. It's not original to me, but so first of all, I go through the various options. If it were up to me and we were living in a perfect world, I would like the idea of an elected Senate that could provide greater representation to the less populous regions. I'm from the West myself,
but
and would rein in the excesses of the more populous regions. But we can't agree on a formula, and the Senate reform has basically been shut down of that kind by the Supreme Court. It's a practical impossibility in my view. But the Senate has the power in itself to rein itself in. It can change its own standing orders. This was a proposal put forward by a couple people, one of which would be Hugh Segal and Michael Kirby, former senators themselves, the late Senator Hugh Segal, where the Senate could simply pass a motion changing its standing orders to read something like, if a bill passed by the Commons has not been passed within 6 months, it shall be deemed to have passed. In other words, they'd have a suspensive veto like they have now for constitutional amendments, but not an absolute veto. And that plus nonpartisan merit-based appointments, if they really were, if you know, one of the things I found recently in the book, since 1958, the British House of Lords, one of the few comparable things of a appointed upper house, 50% of them have been people who were not of the party of the prime minister that appointed them. So 50-50 roughly. In our system, in Canada, up until 2015, 98% of them were the same party as the prime minister that appointed them.
But
so if we had if I could just finish the thought, if we had a genuinely merit-based system and they behaved themselves, then they could acquire moral authority, which I think would be actually kind of a nice idea. I kind of like that idea.
But is it fair to say that the virtuous senators are not about to circumscribe themselves? I guess what I'm trying to get at, without
through a crisis.
Yeah, that was my spoiler alert, but it's been modified. You have to read the book now to see where Andrew goes. But you've heard it for yourself. The question, though, is if senators and the prime minister and others are not going to unilaterally disempower themselves, is not a crisis an opportunity to use the hackneyed cliche from China, which apparently is not true, that the Chinese character has opportunity and crisis together? It's made up. But let's just roll with that. Surely it's when that crisis happens that the opportunity will arise if Canadians can rise to it. Now, you mentioned crisis number 2, because there's so many, which is the turnover of power. You're quite right that Stephen Harper delegitimized a turnover of government by a governor general, but that doesn't mean he will prevail. We saw there is a precedent, as you know, in 1985, which you mentioned in the book, because I know Ontario was important to you, that the lieutenant governor did hand over power to David Peterson and Bob Rae.
And in BC since then.
Yeah, Peterson in particular, and BC, of course, although that underlines the perils of government. Let me just shift gears for a bit, though, and talk about something that's dear to my heart, which is democratic engagement, which is the subtext or maybe the thrust of your book. But when you read Andrew's book and you feel discouraged and demoralized, and I encourage you to be discouraged by the book, you will see that you land on a place where people really are, in larger numbers, disengaged from democracy. So, and to my earlier question about how society, democracy can be a reflection of society. If you ask people why they're not voting, because you track how numbers are going down, particularly provincially, below 50% now for a few elections, people will often say, I don't have enough information. Well, why don't they have enough information? Well, you could also ask yourself, where is newspaper readership today? Sorry, that's my hobby horse, but also where is television viewership? That's fragmented as well. And you look at where the action is, and do people here know how many active users there are on Facebook? 3 billion around the world. On Instagram, 3 billion. On TikTok, 2 billion. So there is engagement. It's just on likes and hearts and thumbs up, but not necessarily in votes. So with that long setup, how do you remedy that kind of democratic engagement?
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, if I may, to keep you where I want you to be, which is mandatory voting.
Yeah,
Can that do it?
I'll get there. So yeah, the turnout is now in Canadian elections is among the lowest in the democratic world. There have been elections recently where the winner of the election was none of the above. In other words, the people who didn't vote outnumbered the votes of the winning party. Registered voters who didn't vote. And yeah, you'll get people offering differing theories of this. Some people will try and claim it's because they're so satisfied with the alternatives that they just don't feel they need to vote because everything's going along great. It doesn't really line up with the data on this. You get other people saying, well, no, but you want to keep it that way because that's an alarm bell. That will tell the people who are running the system it's not working well, and then they'll change. Well, I think we've run that experiment. The alarm bell has been ringing and nothing's changed. I do think there's a certain amount, and I can't prove this, but I think there's a certain amount of data that supports this. There's a certain amount of rational ignorance, which is my MP is not going to make much difference. My vote's not going to make much difference to start with. My MP is not going to make much difference. I can speak from personal experience. I don't think I've ever voted for a winning candidate in an election in my life.
Did you feel it was a wasted vote?
In some ways, yeah. Certainly, once you become aware of alternatives. So I'll just quickly diverge into that, which is, we are used to the idea that the natural and normal system is you elect one MP for each riding, and they get maybe 30% of the vote, and they get all of the representation. And we just kind of go, oh yeah, that's how the system works. And so the 70% who voted for other candidates just might as well have stayed home. They don't. Now, when you say that, and probably some of you are already, the hackles are rising, going, well, there can only be one winner. It's like a sports game. There can only be one winner of a football game. Well, no, it's not a cosmic rule that there can only be one winner. We can have multi-member ridings, which is the critical element in any system of proportional representation. That's what makes a difference between proportional system and a winner-take-all system like ours. So you could have ridings that had 3 or 5, and where, let's say if it's 5, if you got 40% of the vote, you get 2 of those 5. And I mean, I'm oversimplifying how it works, but just along those lines. And if you can do that, and I won't get into right now all the malign effects of first past the post, but if it's available as an alternative, and if we'd get a more representative parliament as a result, we would represent a broader spectrum of the views that are out there. Well, isn't parliament supposed to be representing us? And why on earth wouldn't we? Now I've lost my train of thought as to how.
Let me jump in on that. You've given me an opening there to shut you down for half a second. But what I want to just circle. I promise in front of this audience when we have a nuts and bolts discussion on democracy that we will circle back to electoral reform.
Yeah.
But what I want to engage you on, I can't remember either. What I want to engage you on though, because I want to set this up for Sanjay, because we are.
Oh yeah,
mandatory voting. Mandatory voting in 15 seconds. Yes or no?
Okay. So there's a certain amount of rational ignorance. Okay. So, but the problem with low turnout isn't just that it's low; it's that it's unequally low. some groups turn out less than other groups turn out. And so we're not getting a random sample. Remember the debate about the mandatory census versus the voluntary census. If you have a voluntary census or a voluntary turnout, you get a skewed sample. So if we really want to represent all the people, I think there's a strong case to be made for a nudge, which is what mandatory voting is. In Australia, it's like a $20 fine. Very few people wind up paying it. It just kind of creates an expectation, a social expectation that everybody's voting, why don't you? When they brought in, before they brought in mandatory voting in Australia in 1924, their turnout was about 58, 60%. When they brought it in that election in 24, turnout shot up to 95%, and it stayed there ever since. So wouldn't that be a remarkable change if we had 95% turnout rather than 58 or 60%?
Here's a nudge. I'm a big believer in the nudge theory of economics. It's basically if you charge people 5 cents for a plastic bag, they won't take the plastic bag, or $20 to make you vote. Andrew, suppose you got let's fast forward 15 minutes. We've discussed electoral reform. We've landed on the optimal decision, but we still don't know whether parliamentarians, MPs, would actually open their mouths, even if they do have representation proportionally to what people think, because they have to be mindful of their own party leaders and whips and everybody else. So I guess my question is, this is not a news conference, but let's look at the latest news. Last week, Stephen Guilbeault, former Minister of Environment, left cabinet, spoke out, did the honorable thing, resigned on a matter of principle.
Yes.
Ironically, you are on the other side on the principle. You seem in your columns recently to be supporting the Prime Minister. You think he did the right thing in terms of politics, policy, practical effects, and so on. But Guilbeault resigned.
Yeah.
Does that make you feel better? Is there hope that people like him can actually rise up? Or, just again, spoiler alert, will we always be prisoners of this fear that Canadians have of speaking truth to power, or being prisoners of ambition, not wanting to sacrifice their careers as they climb the greasy flagpole by speaking out of turn?
Well, he's an unusually principled, if you like him, dogmatic if you don't like him, individual. There's not many cabinet ministers like him. But yes, I agree with you. He did the honorable thing. They had basically reversed all the policies that he'd ever stood for. And I think it would be very difficult. He was put in a very difficult position. But I don't think that's going to change the fundamental fact that everything in our system has now geared towards making cabinet ministers, most of them irrelevant. A handful who have particularly the ear of the Prime Minister will have particular roles. But for the most part, there's a lot of placeholders there. Partly that's a function of we've allowed the cabinet to become the largest in the democratic world. Even after Carney cut it from 39 or 40 to 29, and he'll go back up in the course of his government. Even at 29, I think if it's not the largest, it's the second largest, maybe tied with Israel. But at 40 or 39, it was a country mile larger. The OECD average is 19. And we had much smaller cabinets in our history when we were tackling very large things. You know, Mackenzie King fought a depression in World War with 16. Lester Pearson built the modern welfare state with 24. You know, as I say, it's 19 is the average in other countries. It's, I think, 17 in France, 15 in Germany, 22 in Britain. Are we so complicated and so difficult that we need 39? No, it's because we've turned the cabinet basically into what we thought we would have the parliament for. We use the cabinet now to give the representation that people don't really feel like they're getting from their MPs. Well, that's not what cabinet is supposed to be for. And so it leads to the devaluing of individual ministers. The cabinet as a body, I'm told now there's literally a timer. You have 20 seconds, go, to express your complex thought about this or that. Ministers are salespeople for decisions that are made in the Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister's office now has a staff of 120. It's the largest in the democratic world on a proportional to population basis. And all of the powers and all of the perks and everything else are in the hands of the Prime Minister, partly because he's the leader of the party, and leaders of parties have enormous powers over MPs, including the power to appoint them to special offices, but he's also got all the powers of appointment of a prime minister as the head of government. And so it's really hard to speak meaningfully of cabinet government in Canada. And what's striking is when you read, what MPs themselves say after they've left office, and the Samara Institute did some wonderful exit interviews with them where they really fess up to what it was really like now that they're leaving. and cabinet ministers, the memoirs of Mark Garneau, Bill Morneau, and Jody Wilson-Raybould, respectively, the foreign minister, the finance minister, and the justice minister. These are three of the most senior positions. And the theme that runs through them is, I couldn't even get a meeting with the prime minister. Jody Wilson-Raybould maybe had all too many meetings with him of a different kind, but you know, he didn't pay any attention. He didn't seek my advice. Bill Morneau at one point, you know, he was preparing the budget. And obviously in our system, you always consult closely with the prime minister when you're doing that. He was told to send an email, I think it was to Katie Telford, outlining his concerns. So that is how, you know, diminished the role of cabinet ministers has become.
In fairness, Debo got the meetings quite quickly, but maybe he's the exception that proves the rule. Sanjay.
I think that's the most striking thing. I mean, these examples that Andrew's saying. I mean, of all the democracies I study, India most closely. I work on China. You're more likely to be a senior minister in Xi Jinping's government from the account you're telling, and to see the president of China than this. And that's really shocking. So that raises this question. You know, in the book, Andrew, you talk about, and you've said some of it now, the prime minister has enormous powers of appointment. We often hear about the United States. Every time there's an administration change, you know, there's 3,000 executive appointments, but there are many in Canada. So the prime minister's office has great power of appointment over many things. Party leaders have great powers of nomination. So question is still why? So we're a Westminster parliamentary democracy. Britain is, New Zealand, Australia, India of a very different kind because it's own post-colonial history. In all of those places, and I know India and Britain far better than the other two, but still, people speak their mind. It's much more disputatious. The Nobel Prize-winning economist, philosopher Amartya Sen even wrote a book called The Argumentative Indian. You know, you have serious arguments. People resign. There's a lot of cacophony in the public sphere. I mean, members of the parties will be disagreeing with each other. I lived in Britain for 10 years. You'd see this all the time. You know, I was there when Thatcher came down. I was sitting in Parliament, and her cabinet ministers who got up and basically brought her down. What is it about our political culture of deference, of consensus, that makes this happen? So I think, and let me try to set it up this way. We have what's called a winner-takes-all system. That's first past the post. And I'm with you on proportional representation. But it's not simply a mechanical effect, right? It seems to breed exactly that kind of behavior, that every prime minister that comes in, it's a ratchet effect. You know, the last prime minister accumulated power, I'm going to accumulate even more power, and it goes on and on and on. So what is it about our political culture that seems to spike? Because the institutions, I mean, the rules might be different, but they've changed. So it's always a chicken and egg question in social science. You know, institutions breed culture, culture breeds a certain set of institutions. Given that other Westminster parliamentary systems started, or we were more like them before than we are now, then something has changed in our political culture. And I kind of think of it as like this undue deference to authority, searching for consensus. We celebrate our politics of accommodation, but to the point where people are unwilling to sort of assert themselves. What's that?
Well, it is chicken and egg, and the culture and the rules kind of interact with each other. I think in this case, it's more rules than culture, actually. But it then creates a culture. Just before I answer, I just wanted one last point on the prime minister's appointments. The prime minister appoints, this is the most striking one for me of all. The prime minister appoints all of the cabinet ministers chiefs of staff. Right? Your chief of staff is your absolute right-hand person. You're the person you've got to trust on and rely on more than anybody else. And they don't even get to appoint them anymore. They're basically appointed by the prime minister's office and accountable to them. When this was suggested one time in Britain, when Boris Johnson was feuding with Sajid Javid, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it was suggested to him, well, we'd like to appoint your advisors, please. And he resigned on the spot. And he famously said, no self-respecting minister would ever accept such an arrangement. That's what our ministers do every day. So how did we get into this? I think there's a couple of dates that are really key. One is 1919, which is when the Liberals first went to electing the party leader, not by the caucus, which is the traditional way in the Westminster system. I mean, when I say elected, it was oftentimes the previous leader would strongly hint who he thought the caucus should vote for. But it was basically, you know, the caucus consensus, if not an overt election. we went from that system to a delegated convention, national convention. And I think the American influences must surely be a large part of that, the presidential thing. So the presidentialization of Canadian politics really starts, I think, then in a big way. And it's hard to argue against because it sounds, and of course, since then we've moved from delegated conventions to one member, one vote. And of course, it's not just one member, one vote, it's the members plus all the new members that the parties sign up in the course of the leadership campaigns and these frenetic mass membership sales that they use the campaigns as substitutes for. And in the Trudeau example, you didn't even have to be a member of the party, you just had to be a supporter. So it sounds more democratic. Oh, it's the grassroots. Surely that's better than having a clique of MPs elected. And one of the things I try to emphasize in the book is democracy is not just what happens on election day when you vote, it's what happens every day in between. So that system that sounds like it's more democratic essentially makes the leader, once he or she's been elected, accountable to nobody, right? That body that elected him or her disappears the day that the vote is held. Most of them never have anything to do with the party afterwards. They just sign up for that one day. So who holds the party leader to account from that day forward? Nobody does. And it puts the members of caucus in a particularly invidious position because the leader has the absolute power of life or death over their career in 100 different ways. And so they are one of the few groups in Canadian society that doesn't get to elect their own leader. A government with the consent of the governed applies generally in this country, except in the House of Parliament in our major parties. So that's the one thing where members lost that ability to hold the leader to account by being able to hire and fire them. I mean, we'll come back to this, but I think the hiring part is as important as the firing part. The other is that in 1970, we changed the rules so that the ballots the ballots used to just have the name of the candidate and their occupation. They didn't list the parties until 1972, actually, the election. And when they put the party affiliation on, they said, oh, well, if we're going to do that, we're going to have somebody to vouch that this person is actually a member in good standing of the party and is the candidate for the party. Let's make it the leader. Okay, well, now you've given the leader an absolute veto over the candidacy of even sitting MPs, let alone new candidates. That's a pretty strong incentive to stay in line. So the two of them is the caucus doesn't choose the leader, but the leader chooses the caucus. And not only that, but when it comes to the nomination process, which we think of as being an open contest where candidates of various sorts contest for the party nomination at a riding and the members of the riding vote for it, again by the same ridiculous sign-up process. But as often as not, and again, I'm indebted to the Samara Institute in this, in recent elections, an average of 50% of the candidates across all the parties, differing percentages in each party, but the average overall is 50% of them were appointed, flat out. Of those that remained, 2/3 ran unopposed, oftentimes because people knew who was going to win. In the small sliver that remains, a lot of the times, and you can't quantify this, but the stories are legion, somebody in the organizers puts their thumb on the scales one way or another. Oh, the meeting was held yesterday, sorry. Or, no, the signups, they closed a day ago. I know that we only opened them a day ago. So there's all these tricks that go on there. And then finally, when you actually have robust nomination meetings that are actually contested and contestable in a fair way, how do you win? It's by bussing in all kinds of instant members. And we all used to laugh at that in our media circles about the shenanigans that go on. I don't think we're laughing so much since we started seeing that this is now a portal for foreign interference. It's no longer a game. It's China and other countries have seen that in many ridings, which are safe ridings, the real contest is for the nomination for that party. And so we need to get serious about that vulnerability.
Good news is that your friends in the Conservative Party, from what I've read in my Toronto Star, are pushing back against that and trying to force Pierre Poilievre to appoint fewer candidates, but I suspect that may not go very far. Andrew, we don't have much time left, so we don't have the 20-second rule, but we're gonna try to give others a chance. I think we'll try to go into overtime, which is a very Canadian thing. So I do want to ask one quick question just to break things up. So there's only a 2-word answer allowed, 2 names, in fact. And then I will ask another question that I suspect is on the minds of many people. So the question is, on page 106, if I had a free hand, I would show up the book and read it from the book. so many of our prime ministers have become corrupted by the office. I can think of at least two in my lifetime who should probably have ended up behind bars. Now, you're a young man, Andrew, and I know you have legal counsel in the room, but those names are not in the book.
Yeah. Leave it as a delicious mystery.
Okay. I knew that would be a short answer. Okay, I want to get right to the nuts and bolts of this, which is voting, which is and the crusade for proportional representation that is all around us. In some ways, some people care really deeply about it. I suspect some folks in this room. I get a lot of mail about it. We don't discuss it much in the Democracy Forum, but today is your day. But isn't the problem that people in this room and in your circles care passionately about it, but a lot of Canadians don't? And the turnout in the Ontario referendum was abysmally low. The margin of defeat was quite high. Lots of explanations or excuses for that. But at the end of the day, if people were really hankering for PR or MMP, a more modified and or geographically balanced form of proportional representation, isn't that the real challenge, that people aren't exercised by it?
They are and they aren't. It's painted as being this huge change, and in some ways it is huge. In some ways it's not. I mean, the system I favor, the single transferable vote, what do? You mark your ballot 1, 2, 3 instead of putting an X. Big whoop. But it can have.
You say that, but the problem with STV is it sounds like STD. It just sounds complicated.
Exactly. They need a better. But notwithstanding that, the people of British Columbia in the first referendum in 2005 voted 58% in this risk-averse country where we think everything's great. 58% of the population of BC, including a majority in, I think it was 75 of the 77 electoral districts in BC, voted for electoral reform. But the government of the day said, oh, no, the bar was 60%. Sorry. The government was elected by 42%. In Prince Edward Island, in 2013, I think it was, people voted 52% for MMP, for mixed member proportional. But the government of the day said, oh, sorry, the turnout wasn't high enough.
And we use single transferable vote in parties for leadership races.
Well,
it's more of a ranked ballot because and isn't that interesting though, the distinction, because I'm a ranked ballot guy and I get a lot of heat for that. You've landed, spoiler alert, only by default, not by free will, on a ranked ballot as probably the path of least resistance, because STV is a harder sell.
Yeah, I think you could do it in 2 leaps. So you bring in ranked ballots first.
Ranked ballot, just to simplify, is basically an electronic runoff. It's basically, you have 5 candidates instead of a plurality where somebody can win with only 32% because everyone else splits the vote. Yeah. A ranked ballot, you basically end up with a runoff so that one person has to get over 50% of the votes.
Based on French presidential election.
Well, that's one model. And then the model that we're familiar with from the leadership races is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each person gets knocked out and you transfer the second choices. But it's not a proportional system. It's still a winner-take-all system. It's just the winner actually has to get a majority of the vote. But if you want a proportional system,
big difference between winner-take-all with 31% and winner-take-all with 51% in a riding election.
It's certainly better, but it's still, you're leaving 50% of the voters unrepresented. So to get to PR, all you have to do is add multi-member ridings to that. And so ranked ballots plus multi-member ridings is STV. So maybe one way to do it is you do the ranked ballots first, and then then after people got used to that, you say, well, let's move to multi-member ridings. I'm going to lose my train of thought again.
That's perfect. Sanjay, jump in, because you were going to ask about what the outcome, if we land eventually on the ranked ballot and then single transferable vote where you have multi-member constituencies, which is basically a ranked ballot with a more proportional outcome, if I may. Then you end up with a parliament with different parties represented. Sanjay, over to you.
Yeah. So most systems, as Andrew says in the book, that have proportional representation, different varieties, right? In Europe tend to have coalition governments, really diverse ones. India, which I studied for many years, had 25 years, uninterrupted quarter century of coalition governments, the largest, most diverse in the world, as you would expect in India, despite having first past the post. But here's then the question, and it comes back to this question of culture and expectations of Canadians, how they would feel about it, how politicians would deal with it. Coalition governments are messy. There's a lot of contestation, often out in the open. There's a lot of haggling, horse tradings going on. And in India, in some cases, you get lots of accusations of what they call unholy alliances. So you'll get parties that will compete together before the election. But as we know, as you've seen electoral fragmentation rise across the West in the last 20, 25 years, more and more minority parliaments, more and more hung parliaments, you're going to get a lot of post-poll haggling going on. And, supporters of the Social Democrats in Germany are seriously opposed to the Christian Democrats and others, and vice versa, as would be here. So that's, again, maybe it's a cultural argument or a cultural question, again, which is, given that we have a system in which, like you say, people say, well, winner take all seems fine for people who think it's fine, and our politicians behave that way. How do you think that, I'm in favor of this, but how do you think that's going to play out? Because, coalition governments can take a really long time to form. And Belgium and Netherlands are the two outlier cases, months and months and months. You have a caretaker government. No budget can be passed. No serious decisions can be made. We're not used to that in this country.
But those are, first of all, those are the outlier cases. So we hear about them because there's 100-odd countries that have PR. So chances are at any given time, one of them is going to go into, have some sort of issue like that. We've had those issues in the recent past in our country. So one of the few remaining arguments for first past the post, the idea that it produces, the firm smack of authority. You say what you will about it, at least it elects, stable majority governments. 6 of our last 8 elections federally have been minority governments, minority parliaments. So you get that firm smack of authority if you have a two-party system, but we haven't had a two-party system in this country since 1921. Once you crack the mold, and in a regionalized country like Canada, first past the post really encourages that. It's different if you have a small compact country, but if you have a country like ours where things naturally tend towards the regional, first past the post rewards parties that can bunch their votes geographically. So classic example in 1993, the Conservatives, the Reform Party, and the Bloc all got about the same number of votes. They all got about 16% of the vote. But the Conservatives got 2 seats, and the Reform and the Bloc each got 50 plus because their vote was bunched. I keep losing my train of thought. Lack of sleep. Don't jump in, Martin. Thank you.
Well, I jump.
Our system already is producing that kind of quote unquote instability. We think of minority parliaments as being quote unquote unstable because of the incentives built into our system. Because our system is so highly leveraged, and by leveraged, I mean a 2% swing in the popular vote leads to a 60-seat swing in the number of seats you have, because it's all about split votes and narrow margins, et cetera. And so in our system, everybody's got their finger over the button the whole time. If they go up in the polls, okay, let's force election. Or if they go down in the polls, no, we don't want to force, but some other party is up in the polls and they want to. In a non-leveraged system, in a proportional system, 2% more of the vote means 2% more seats. There's no payoff to it. So people settle down and get on with the business of governing. Yes, it means typically multi-party majorities, but at least they're majorities. At least they represent a majority. I think we can handle that. The whole thing has been, to come back to one of Martin's questions, we're on a process of education. When that Ontario referendum was held, the level of education in this country, in this province, particularly among the media, was abysmal. The kinds of things you saw people saying about it. And of course, the first sign of somebody who's not done their homework about this issue is they say, that's the system in Israel, which is kind of like saying we shouldn't have the first past the post system because that's the system in Zimbabwe, right? You can always find an example of where it's gone all right. In Israel's case, because they have the most extreme form of PR matched only by the Netherlands. And what's common to both those countries is they're the size of a postage stamp. And therefore, the whole country is one electoral district. So the whole Knesset, 120 members, is elected from one electoral district. If you slice up the vote 120 ways, you can slice it pretty finely, and you get a lot of parties. But the typical PR system will have maybe 7 or 8 parties. We've got 5 or 6 now, only they're regionally based rather than ideologically based. So yeah, we'd have a few more parties. We'd have a bit more negotiation. Most of the time in most countries, it works out pretty smoothly. So don't let a couple of scare stories blind you to the larger reality.
And Andrew, the 20-second clock keeps going off, but I keep shutting it down. We're almost at the end of our time, so I'm hoping we can go into overtime for just a few minutes. I looked at our Slido Democratic app, which is a proxy for proportional representation, and I couldn't find any questions on Slido. So I'm either disconnected or disengaged, or all of you are trying to go analog. So we'll give you a 2-second warning. And Sanjay has a very quick question that's standing between the public and Andrew. Go ahead.
I'm in trouble. So it's not a question. I think one example you don't give in the book, which would be good for the argument, is Sweden. So there you've had minority governments for the longest time, but they're stable. They get things done because the parliamentary committees are so powerful. So whoever's in power, they still have to get their legislation really vetted through parliamentary committees, and that's something else that you talk about. So.
Oh, that was a statement, not a question. That's not allowed, by the way. You can't do that. No, I'm kidding. So we're at 1 o'clock. Quick question from some folks here. Yes, I saw you had your hand up. Go ahead. Yes. And don't be like Sanjay. Question, not a statement.
I have one statement.
Definitely. Thank you very much for the panel. The question I have is, Andrew, for you that is almost a market-driven person, how do you think that the PM's appointment of private sector executives to run organizations, for example, the defense one, how does that help with consolidating power in a democracy?
I'm neither for it nor against it. I think it depends on the individual. Oftentimes, people who have run corporations get into politics and finds that it's vastly different than anything they've known. So we shouldn't fall in the trap of saying, we want government to run like a business, because they're vastly different types of organizations. And to say politics is a really difficult art. Now, these are people who are appointed to run organizations, and to me, it just depends on the individual. The problem, I think, the broader problem is, it's not just that the prime minister's powers of appointment are so vast, including appointing all the Senate and all the Supreme Court and all of the heads of the military and all the heads of the Crown Corporation. It's that there's no vetting and no independent oversight of any of these, or very little. We're only just starting to nibble and experiment at this. And that's what really needs to happen is you need to have some body that can overlook, can either make recommendations to the prime minister or can vet the appointments that he makes, or some combination of the two. But the system we have now, where there's just these thousands of appointments that are just the personal purview of one person, there's nothing like it in the world.
Thanks. Over there. Yes, you had your hand up. Yep. Too late. The microphone's there.
Thank you. So there was a proposal in the U.S. Congress to allow U.S. government police officers to be stationed abroad. And the specific perspective for where those U.S. police officers should be stationed is in Canada. So my question is, let's say the government signed on to that proposal. And to be fair, the Prime Minister has vowed a new economic and security relationship with the U.S., which could very well include this. What would the effects of that proposal be on Canada in terms of democracy, or even in terms of national security be?
I think the short answer to that is I don't know. I'm not keen on the idea. I'd have to look at the details, but certainly worth looking at. But I just don't know enough about that particular proposal to be able to give you a good answer.
Yeah, and I think it probably came up with the Nexus card dispute. Okay, one more quick question before I jump back in. Yes, go ahead.
I just think there's a cultural issue here, and that is that governments are trying to convey complex issues like the oil to the West Coast. It's very complicated. But the right-wing approach to issues is to make everything black and white, simple, sometimes even a strong leadership issue. So the culture is, when you're talking about trying to expand the democracy onto the ground, there's a lot of pressure to not do that.
Yeah. What you're describing, I think, is largely one of the failings just of democracy. You're dealing with imperfect human beings. You're dealing with a large distracted population that's got a million things on their minds. 'Twas ever thus, to some extent, that if you're going to get people's attention and persuade them, you have to boil things down either certainly to a simple level, and oftentimes, as you say, to a simplistic level. By the way, I think you can find examples on the right and the left of that over the years. Where right now, the populist ascendancy within the right wing is very much, as you say, trafficking not just in simplistic things, but falsehoods. That's beyond the ken of the book. The book is not trying to analyze the failings of democracy, but the failings of our particular instance of it, where we've allowed a lot of the conventions and rules and institutions that govern our democracy to degrade. I do think that interacts, to come back to the thing we were talking earlier, with the culture. I will say, and I probably don't emphasize this enough in the book, we still have, God bless us, a relatively healthy political culture in this country. We don't regard each other as enemies. Power transfers peacefully. We don't seek revenge on our opponents when we get into power, these kinds of things. But it's eroding. We're under some of the same pressures that the Americans are and other democracies are. And one of the things that can be a bulwark against further erosion is strengthening our institutions. If we have a parliament that works better, that people can look at that and go, that's my parliament. That's my member of parliament who's doing a good job representing me in that parliament. I think it helps draw us together and keep us together as a people. When we see our conflicts and our divisions and our differences acted out in one forum, in a kind of a relatively harmless way, where we're not sort of drawing off and drawing swords on each other, but having arguments in the chamber of the House of Commons. That's a powerful force for reinforcing those democratic norms and those healthy civic cultures that remain a strength of this country.
We are not just out of time, but just about out of overtime. But I do get the last question, and I want to I ask this question of everybody at the end, so it's not exactly a trick question. It's predictable, but I always ask politicians about what their advice is to students and others about getting into politics. But just listening to what you were saying about our political culture, Sanjay, Andrew, I believe democracy is only as good as the people who are in it. I happen to believe that. It's not it's not a theory of history, but I believe that our politicians are on balance better than politicians in many other countries, whether it's our prime minister or our opposition leader, in terms of polarization and peaceful transfer of power and democratic norms. So my question to you is, having run down politics, I'm trying to be provocative here, but really in the book, you make it sound really unappetizing, unproductive, unfulfilling, a miserable experience. Why would any sane person run to be an MP or even a minister, or certainly an opposition MP in this country or in any province? So what words of advice and encouragement do you have to bring out a better class of person into our politics?
Well, it's a dilemma, because there's a certain self-selection that goes on right now. People are aware, largely, of how meaningless the job of an MP has become. So if you kind of go into it, you're sort of signing up for it. And that's one of the biggest obstacles, is the people in politics, MPs, are collaborating in their own servitude. They've internalized all of these assumptions. If you talk, for example, to MPs about, I think members of caucus should elect a leader, they will say, well, us nobodies, why would we get to do that? So there has to be a cultural change, and it's hard to get the culture to change until you give them meaningful work to do. When MPs have real responsibilities and real roles, you'll get a lot better people going in. So I guess my two pieces of advice beyond don't would be, don't go in unless you're proposing to change it. And be aware of how hard it will be to change it, because it's not just the powers and perks of the leader versus the caucus, it's the peer pressure you're going to face from your fellow MPs. I mentioned it as an anecdote in the book that when Jody Wilson-Raybould did the right thing and blew the whistle on Justin Trudeau for interfering in a criminal prosecution and was forced out of cabinet, and Jane Philpott resigned in solidarity with her, you may recall, they were both kicked out of caucus by Justin Trudeau. And when they announced it at the caucus meeting, the members of caucus stood up and cheered. They didn't take the side of their fellow MPs who'd done the right thing and paid the price. Well, I understand. Maybe you might say, I didn't think you did exactly the right thing there. I would have approached it differently. But they cheered because they'd gotten what for. It's a team sport. And if maybe you're prepared to sacrifice your own career for your beliefs, maybe you're willing to take a stand on principle and pay the price, but you're going to get a bunch of other people in the caucus saying, you and your precious conscience, don't ruin this for the rest of us. This is a team sport. They've all internalized. So that's my first piece of advice, is don't go into there unless you've got the guts to change that and are smart about it. And the second thing, maybe more practically, is don't go into politics until you've done something else, both in terms of life experience, but also so you got some money so you can walk away if you have to. The really sad thing is people get in and they've got nowhere else to go. This is the best job they're ever going to have. And that's really sad. Maybe exceeded only by the fact that they will sit and put a grin on their face and suffer any amount of humiliation for years at a time because they're hoping to get into cabinet. And if I get into cabinet, then all this will have been worth it. And they get into cabinet and they find out they're still a nobody. They're just a nobody with a car and driver. And that is the most pathetic part of the whole thing.
Andrew, in 20 seconds or less, why don't you run?
Because I lack the ambition or the abilities or the inclination or the support base. Politics is a skilled profession. It requires certain skills that I do not have. And it's an awful job, and I don't want to have an awful job. I have a nice job now.
All right, time's up. I want to thank our guest. Thank you to Andrew Coyne. Special thanks to my colleague Sanjay Ruparelia, and a big shout out to the team at the dais that supports the Democracy Forum. Thank you all for coming. Merci, Megwetch. Safe travels. Bye.